Welcome to today's forum on the State Board of Education, District 6. Again, I'm grateful to our sponsors, the YWCA, the Hastings Area Chamber of Commerce, and the League of Women Voters. Since we did introductions before, I'm going to move right on to the candidate part of this, and we're going to begin with a 2-minute statement from Shirley Walgren, who will be speaking and reading a statement from Sherry Jones. The two candidates for this District State Board of Education 6 are Daniel Helzer and Sherry Jones, but Sherry had a conflict today and was unable to attend. So thank you to Shirley for standing in for her. And again, Shirley will be simply doing an opening 2-minute statement. So let's begin with that opening statement by Shirley.
Thank you. As a candidate for State Board of Education District 6, I have traveled nearly 15,000 miles over the last 16 months, listening to and speaking with the people of this area. Based on these interactions and the results of the primary election, I am convinced my beliefs and values align closely with the majority of District 6 patrons. Having taught for 35 years, I have an understanding of the needs of both teachers and students. In my opinion, one of the most pressing needs is addressing the school staff shortage. Finding ways to recruit and retain teachers is paramount to the health of our Nebraska school system. To protect our children, I will continue to voice my opposition to comprehensive sex education, which threatens to sexualize and confuse children, leads them to make decisions they may come to regret, and undermines parent decision-making. I am a supporter of local decision-making, for I believe parents and community members together know best the needs of their children. If elected to the State Board of Education, I will be an advocate for all forms of education, public, private, parochial, and homeschooling, for I believe one form does not fit all best. Having said that, we must have high-quality public schools to which parents can confidently send their children, for that is where most Nebraska children are educated. Come November 8th, I would appreciate the opportunity to serve Nebraska in making education in the Good Life State even better. To learn more about me as a person and candidate, at the stop? Okay. I encourage you to visit my website at www.sherry4nekids.com. Thank you.
Thank you, Shirley, for doing that statement for Sherry Jones. Now we'll have the opening statement by Daniel Helzer.
Good afternoon, everyone. Public forums and debates are long-standing traditions in democracy, and it is a candidate's duty to participate in them to provide voters with transparency. So thank you to the Chamber, the League of Women Voters, the YWCA of Adams County for providing opportunities for the public to engage with local candidates. Nebraska has a long history of providing quality education. Recently, U.S. News & World Report has ranked Nebraska 9th in the nation for the strength of its public schools. Our public schools and their staff were heralded as essential workers at the start of the pandemic. They did the unthinkable. They pivoted to online instruction, they fed thousands of families, set up internet hotspots, provided opportunities for students to connect with their peers. We saw the narrative toward schools change just a few years later with the introduction of health standards in Nebraska. And suddenly, school staff and board members were labeled groomers and indoctrinators. This rhetoric, what we first heard on the national stage, is not helpful for solving the real problems facing public schools in Nebraska today. Schools are struggling to retain and recruit teachers. Enrollment in Nebraska's teacher preparation programs has been on the decline since at least 2017. Students are struggling with mental and behavioral health crises exacerbated by a global pandemic. Chronic absenteeism is up 70% in Nebraska, and the achievement gap between English learners and other learners continues to widen. As the District 6 representative, I am committed to identifying and eliminating barriers to recruiting and retaining Nebraska's teachers. I will be a strong advocate for continual access to mental and behavioral health support for both students and staff. I will ensure that all students have equitable access to a high-quality education, which must include early childhood education. And finally, I will work with legislators to increase state funding and advocate for keeping our current federal funding so our schools can continue doing the critical work of developing the next generation. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle. Now we would go to questions from the media, but before we do that, our two timers are Ann Hinton and Judy Hall. Danielle, since you are the only one, we might get a little bit lax with the red, yellow, and green. So I'll leave that up to the timekeepers. And remember, anyone who has a question from the audience, please raise your hand, and one of our lead members will pick up that paper from you, and it will be brought to the table over here with Judy Reimer and Judy Sandine, who will compose that into a question that I can present to Danielle. Okay, so Will, from the Hastings Tribune, we're ready for your first question.
All right. The first question I have here is, how do you see the State Board of Education being in a position to best support teachers on a local level?
Thank you for that question. That's fantastic. One of the things that I think needs to really happen with the State Board of Education is including teachers in the policymaking process. Other states do this. Wyoming is a state that has teachers and school staff that are voting members on the State Board of Education, and I'd really like to see that. We cannot keep making policies on behalf of people without including them in the policy-making process. So I would like to see a stronger inclusion of teachers and school staff and administrators in working with the State Board of Education. I also want to, emphasize that Nebraska has always been a local control state, and that is a firm value that I have. It works best in Nebraska. Our local school districts are in the best position to know what is best and what curricula best represents their students. So we also need to make sure we maintain that.
All right, thank you. Then the other thing I was going to ask is, I guess you kind of addressed this a little bit, but how important is that local control to be for the local school districts to have the final word on what curriculums they're going to use?
It's absolutely vital. Like I mentioned before, our local schools know what's best for their students. The State Board of Education is in the business of helping to create standards, and the local schools then get to interpret how they meet and exceed those standards. And so we need to make sure that we're doing that, because it does make for strong local schools, and it helps to increase attendance rate when our students are learning things that relate to their communities. So we have to absolutely protect and maintain that in Nebraska.
Will, do you have any other questions right now?
I would also ask, I guess, why are you interested in being elected to this position?
Thanks for that question. I am a former teacher myself. I taught for 8.5 years across Nebraska schools. I taught clear out in southwest Nebraska and teeny tiny Perkins County, but I've also taught in more urban schools and in suburban school settings. So I taught in Ogallala, I taught in Gretna, I taught in Omaha Public Schools and Burke High School. I've also taught at the community college level in Grand Island and in Hastings, and I've adjuncted. I taught teachers at UNL and in UNO, and that experience has really given me a well-rounded perspective of education in Nebraska. And I'm incredibly interested in the policy-making process. As a teacher, I would have students that would come into my classroom and their needs were so huge. And there's only so much a teacher can do to address some of those systemic issues. And I think, I have a good mind for that. I've been addressing and working on policy for the last few years. And so I want to bring that expertise and experience into the State Board of Education.
Okay, do we have some questions from the audience? Danielle, our first question is, how can the Nebraska Board of Education support all underlying students?
So I think the Nebraska State Board of Education can support all students by making sure that students are at the center of our policy-making decisions. And when we think about students, we have to think about all students, because public schools are one of the only remaining institutions in our country left open for all people. So that is challenging, right? As a public school teacher, I had students from all walks of life. I had students from upper income brackets and students from very, very low income brackets. I had students with no homes. I had students that were on various spectrums of the gender identity. I had students of different sexual identities that were different than mine. Students with different backgrounds. We have to consider all of that. And in order to do that, we have to make sure that we have diversity in our committees, in our policy-making process, and really that we include teachers in that process, because they know their students, right? They know the issues that they're facing in the classroom. But we have to make sure that we're including all voices in the policy-making process so that all students can be represented in our public schools.
The next question is, there's been a lot of discussion about school choice, and I was hoping you could explain to people what that actually means. So what does school choice actually mean?
Yeah, actually I want to say that Nebraska already has really strong school choice. So in Nebraska, we have public schools. In our public school districts, students can, and parents and families can often choose to send their child to a different school within the district if there's, several elementary schools. So for example, we live in Grand Island, and we did not send our kids to the neighborhood school. We sent them to a different public school, one that best represented who they were. So that's how we have school choice already in public schools. We also have rural schools that accept a lot of option students. So I met with the superintendent at Homer, which is clear up in northeast Nebraska, and they have a large percentage of students who are optioned in from outside communities because their families wanted smaller environment, and still to attend a public school. In Nebraska, we also have strong private schools. We have incredible parochial schools. I have a child in the public schools, and I have one child in the private schools. So I've got a foot in both worlds, and I see that they each serve a different purpose for each kid, because each kid is different. Our public schools, our private schools also do an incredible job of providing financial aid to families who maybe can't afford that high price of tuition. And then the last option we have for education in Nebraska is homeschooling. Families have the right to homeschool their children, and we need to maintain that, because again, that works for a lot of families. I am not in the business of providing public dollars for private education, though. And so Nebraska does not allow vouchers and charters in our state. And what happens with vouchers and charters when we introduce that kind of concept is that we can deny students an education, and a voucher and a charter school can, just like a private school can. But then we're giving public dollars to a voucher school to deny a student an education. That's problematic, as I'm sure you can all do that sort of deductive reasoning on your own. But then additionally, what happens is that it starts to starve the budgets of public schools. So it effectively starts to defund our public schools. And that's not great for kids that don't have access to charters, vouchers, and private education.
I'm going to borrow the mic for this question because it has a little bit more verbiage on it. Could you discuss whether you support curricula based on 1619 project? To your knowledge, do you know whether it is currently being used in any of Nebraska's public schools?
That's a great question. I support the 1619 project itself. I think it's an excellent body of work. I think it's an essential body of work to understanding a very true and clear picture of American history. Now, in terms of it being a curriculum in schools, I've not seen that. And here's the thing, again, like I mentioned, local schools can decide their own curriculum. So yes, it may have been a resource on the Nebraska Department of Education website, which I know, made a lot of people upset and angry. But it's just a resource. It's not a required curricula. It's something that teachers could use bits and pieces of. They could use parts of it, when they're teaching about the slave trade. or when the African slaves first arrived in our country. So it's a resource that's available. I have not heard or seen it being used in a particular classroom. That doesn't mean that a teacher may not be using an article from it or a podcast from it. I've also, listened to the entire 1619 project. I've read the articles, and I support them. I think they're a fabulous piece of history.
I wonder to let everyone in the audience know what is the 1619 project. Can you do a Reader's Digest summary of that?
So the 1619 project was a project by Nicole Hannah-Jones. She's a Pulitzer Prize-winning author, she's a professor, and she's a scholar. And she really did some great historical digging and putting together some information about the slave trade and how, America and our colonists brought slaves to the country. And so she kind of talks just through that, what that's like, and then how that impacts American policy later on through the years. Because we all know, right, that we have historical roots that end up impacting American policy throughout the years. That's the Reader's Digest version. But you can also Google it.
Thank you. The next question.
How do you plan to address the increase of mental health needs in students and staff?
This is a question that is just so near and dear to my heart. In central Nebraska, we have an incredible lack of mental health resources. I know mental health professionals who have waiting lists that are 6 months to 12 months long. And there were times where my husband and I drove one of our children to Omaha once a week to get the services that he needed because we couldn't find it in central Nebraska. And this was at the height of COVID, when schools weren't open. And so now we're seeing, we had mental health crises and issues before the pandemic, okay? I want to be clear on that. But the COVID pandemic just sort of cracked everything open and made things even more difficult for students and teachers. And so now we have, students going back to school after having lived through 3 years of a global pandemic. Some of them maybe have lost family members, neighbors, community members, and they've certainly felt the isolation that we all felt during COVID. And that's not going to go away anytime soon. I think the state's done an incredible job of allocating some of the federal dollars that the federal government has passed down, and then saying, allocate some of these for mental and behavioral health support. I'm concerned that when those federal dollars go away, we're going to lose that push. And then what happens, like a school district like South Sioux City, which is in District 6, South Sioux City has worked with a counseling office out of Norfolk. And they have contracted mental health professionals, and they've placed a mental health professional in every building in South Sioux City. That's incredible, right? It's an awesome resource for students. Teachers and staff are also able to use that resource during the school day, which I think is fantastic. But what happens when those federal dollars dry up? We can't just remove all those mental health professionals from the school, right? We're still going to have these issues long after we see COVID, going away, if it ever goes away. But I think that we have to be really intentional. Local school districts have to be really intentional to either find funds, advocate for more funding so that they can hire their own sort of in-house mental health professionals, or get really creative like some of these other districts are doing and contract out. Grand Island Public Schools is using a program called Hello Heroes, where they're doing telehealth appointments. So obviously parents give consent for all of this. Parents are always informed in the process that schools take part in. And then students get to meet with a mental health professional through telehealth, through the computer at school. So these are things that have to continue long after we see the ripple effects of COVID sort of go away.
We're getting some hard questions here, so.
Bring it on. Yeah, it's fine.
What is your response to the attacks on teachers by voters, the public, and maybe also by candidates running for the State Board of Education?
Yeah, this is something that has been really difficult for me. Again, I am a former public school teacher. I taught for 8.5 years. My husband, who's not here because he's a high school principal, so he is at school, he was a classroom teacher for 15 years before moving into an administration position. And we attended a film. We attended the Mind Polluter screening, one of the screenings that was in Grand Island. And that was one of the hardest things for me to sit through because I felt like it was an attack on the teaching profession. And the people that I know and love, many of them are teachers. And I don't know a teacher, that has deliberately set up their students to fail, as the film claims. The film claims that schools are churches for atheists. I don't see that. I mean, schools have FCA programs, they have opportunities for Muslim students to pray throughout the day, they respect things like Ramadan, they allow students to have their own prayer time if they'd like that. So to hear some of these attacks on public education and on teachers, to me, is just a fear tactic to gain power. It's not based in reality. It's not what's actually happening in our schools. And let me be clear, fear is a very powerful tool, and I think there are a lot of valid fears and concerns out there. But a lot of those fears and concerns could be quelled by visiting your local school, by talking with your teachers. Our neighbors are teachers. Like, we go to church with teachers. You see them at the grocery store. The #1 reporter of sexual abuse and sexual assault are teachers. So to call them groomers, to paint them as pedophiles, to say that they're indoctrinating their students is disingenuous.
Our last question from the audience, and then we'll go to a closing statement if you would like one. It says, what is your response to the opinion that students are taught that they are oppressors or oppressed based on the color of their skin?
Again, having taught in the classroom, never heard that language once, that students were oppressors or that they were oppressed. Now, there's language certainly that's used, maybe when we talk about history, right? When we talk about oppressed groups of people. But I don't know any teacher in K-12 education in Nebraska that is calling one particular group of students oppressors and one particular group of students oppressed.
Would you like a closing statement?
My opponent has been traveling the state with 3 other candidates and Matt Innes, speaking to crowds of echo chambers. They show films like The Mind Polluters and appear at events that do nothing but sow division and distrust in our communities in an attempt to gain power. In contrast, I've shown up at community events like Grand Island's 4th Street Festival, Winnebago's Pow Wow, the Siouxland Days Latino Festival, Pride events in several District 6 communities, at the Sudanese Assimilation Center, Grand Island's Eid Day celebration. And I've listened to school staff, to community leaders, to parents, and to students, one of our most important groups of people that we need to listen to. I've invited people who disagree with me into face-to-face conversations. Even people who have called me a groomer, I've invited them into face-to-face conversations. And I've worked my hardest to find common ground with these people. There is enough polarization and vitriol in the country right now, and I'm committed to ensuring that our schools are not a political battleground for the latest fear tactics. On November 8th, please vote for a candidate who shows up for the community. Vote for a candidate who believes in public education. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle. Also, thank you to the audience for coming today to this State Board of Education Candidate Forum. And I want to again thank the media and to thank the YWCA for hosting us. I also want to remind you about 2 other informational programs concerning the general election referendums. Information on the voter ID will be held right here in this room on Friday, October 7th, again between noon and 1 o'clock. And then the following Friday, October 14th, on the minimum wage, which is a referendum on the ballot on November 8th. Also, the Board of Education in Hastings is sponsoring a forum for the Hastings Education Association is sponsoring a forum for the Hastings Public School Board. That one is Monday, October 3rd at 7, and that one is at the Lincoln Elementary School. Again, thank you to all of our co-sponsors. And if any of you are interested in becoming a League of Women Voters member with us, we currently have our membership open and would love to talk with you about membership. So again, thank you for coming, and that concludes our candidate forums for this afternoon. Thank you.